The silence that followed Dante Salvatore's words was deafening. In the imposing conference room on the 67th floor of Salvatore Tower, its glass walls embracing Manhattan like a conquered kingdom, 60 journalists were suspended in a moment of collective shock. Cameras still flashed, recorders still captured every breath, but the world had stopped. "She is my wife by contract, not mine." The words echoed through the room with the devastating force of an emotional earthquake. Earthquake. Dante didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone understood. The press had gotten what they wanted. A confession that New York's most admired marriage was nothing more than a gilded farce. In the front row, Chloe Lawrence Salvatore felt her world collapse like a castle of cards in the wind. Her hands, which moments before had been nervously smoothing her navy blue Valentino dress, the one Dante himself had chosen because it brought out the sapphire of her eyes, now trembled uncontrollably in her lap. She had come to support him, as she always did. The devoted wife, the perfect partner, the woman who had transformed the cold Salvatore mansion into a home that exuded elegance and warmth. She was there because she believed that, despite everything, something real had been growing between them. Something that transcended the cold clauses of their marital agreement. How wrong she had been. For a devastating fraction of a second, Chloe's eyes met Dante's. In that glance, she saw something that made her understand the full extent of her delusion. Relief. He looked relieved to have finally spoken the truth he had always known. A truth she had refused to accept. Asterisk, contract. Asterisk. The word reverberated in her mind like a death sentence. Not wife, not partner, not the woman he loved, just a contract. The growing murmur of the journalists, questions being shouted, cameras repositioning to capture her reaction, became a distant hum. Chloe rose with the dignity she had learned to cultivate over the past 18 months as Dante Salvatore's wife. Every movement was a masterpiece of control over the chaos erupting inside her. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the Italian marble with military precision as she walked toward the exit. She did not run. She did not look back. She did not allow a single tear to escape before the hungry cameras. But inside, Chloe Lawrence Salvatore was shattering into a million pieces. Dante watched her go, and only then, far too late, did he realize he had just destroyed the only truly precious thing in his life. The woman who had transformed his existence from that of a ruthless CEO into something that resembled happiness. The conference room door closed behind Chloe with a definitive click, like the distant echo of a heart that had just stopped beating. And Dante Salvatore, the man who controlled a billion-dollar empire, who moved mountains with a single word, who had never lost a single negotiation, understood that he had just lost the only battle that truly mattered. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 6 months earlier, when it had all begun with a contract signed in gold ink and hearts that did not yet know they were meant to fall. The law firm of Morrison and Associates occupied 3 entire floors of a historic building in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. It was the kind of place where billion-dollar deals were born and buried, where destinies were sealed with the cold elegance of a letterhead. Chloe Lawrence adjusted the strap of her vintage handbag for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. The waiting room, with its caramel-colored Italian leather sofas, and authentic Persian rugs, was more intimidating than impressive. Every detail whispered of power and money, two elements that had never been part of her world until 3 weeks ago, when her life had crumbled like a poorly built building. Lawrence and Sons, the architecture firm founded by her father 40 years prior, was on the verge of bankruptcy. Not from incompetence. Chloe had built the small family firm into one of the most respected in Brooklyn, but from a series of disastrous investments her father had made before he died, trying to expand into Manhattan without sufficient capital. $3 million. That was the sum that separated her company from complete ruin, her 22 employees from unemployment, and her mother from losing the house she'd grown up in. Miss Lawrence? The voice belonged to an impeccably dressed assistant who appeared like an elegant apparition. Mr. Salvatore is ready for your Dante Salvatore. The name echoed through the corridors of New York Power like both a promise and a threat. At 34, he had transformed his family's investment firm into an empire that spanned 3 continents. He was known for his ruthless intelligence, his ability to see opportunities where others saw only problems, and for his meticulously private, personal life. Chloe knew him only from the pages of business magazines and society photos. Hair as dark as midnight, eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that rarely reached them. He was handsome in the way powerful men often are, not because of perfect features, but because of the magnetic confidence he radiated. The office door opened to reveal a space that was an extension of Dante himself, sophisticated, imposing, and slightly intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, while mahogany bookshelves housed not only business texts, but first editions of literary classics. A glass and steel desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it, Miss Lawrence. Dante's voice was exactly as Chloe had imagined. Deep, controlled, with a hint of an Italian accent inherited from his grandparents. Please, sit. He rose to greet her, and Chloe immediately understood why cameras failed to capture his full presence. Dante Salvatore radiated an energy that filled the room, an intensity that made the air feel denser. He wore a charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that was clearly custom made, and as he extended his hand, Chloe noticed his long, elegant fingers, a pianist's hands on the body of a corporate predator. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Salvatore, she managed to say, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I know your time is precious. Dante, please. The smile that touched his lips was brief, but genuine. And believe me, my time has never been better spent. There was something in the way he looked at her that made Chloe feel both scrutinized and admired. It wasn't the predatory gaze she had learned to recognize in other powerful men, but something more subtle, a curiosity mixed with an unexpected approval. I'll be direct, Chloe. He returned to his chair, and she noted how his movements were controlled, almost feline. I need a wife, and you need $3 million. I propose we solve both our problems. The brutal simplicity of the statement left her speechless for a moment. She had come prepared to plead, to suffer the humiliation of begging for a loan she knew she couldn't repay. She was not prepared for this. A wife? She repeated slowly, as if testing the word. You're talking about a real legal marriage, with all the paperwork. Dante opened a leather-bound folder on his desk. My grandparents, who control 51% of Salvatore Holdings, are traditionalists. They believe a single man of 34 is unstable, unreliable to lead a family empire. They established a clause in their will. To inherit my full share, I must be married to a suitable woman for at least 2 years. Chloe felt as if she were watching a surreal play in which she'd been unexpectedly called to the stage. And I'm suitable? You're an architect, a Columbia graduate. You've built a reputable company from the ground up. You come from a respectable family. You have no scandals in your past. You aren't driven by social ambition and, he paused, almost imperceptibly. You are genuinely beautiful, without trying to draw attention to yourself. The last observation made her blush, and she saw something shift in his eyes, a subtle warmth that vanished so quickly she almost doubted she'd seen it. What exactly are you proposing? Dante slid a document across the desk. The paper was heavy, expensive, its gold letterhead gleaming in the soft office light. A 2-year marriage contract. You receive $3 million immediately to save your company, plus a monthly allowance for personal expenses. In return, you will play the role of my wife at necessary social and family events. Chloe picked up the document with slightly trembling hands. The clauses were detailed, almost clinical in their precision. Residence at the Salvatore Mansion in Manhattan. Joint public appearances as required. Absolute discretion regarding the nature of the agreement. And, on page 3, a section that made her swallow hard. A physical relationship by mutual consent only, she read aloud. I'm not a monster, Chloe. His voice had taken on a softer quality. I expect nothing from you beyond what is clearly stated. If we choose to explore other aspects of marriage, it will be because we both desire it. She lifted her eyes from the document to find his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. There was something unsaid in his words, a promise, or perhaps a question, that neither of them was ready to voice. 2 years, she murmured. 2 years. After which, an amicable divorce, a non-disclosure agreement, and you walk away with an additional settlement sufficient to ensure you never have to worry about money again. It was an offer she couldn't refuse. It would save her company, her family, her future. But as she looked at the man across the desk, this stranger who was offering to solve all her problems in exchange for 2 years of her life, Chloe felt a shiver of premonition. Dante Salvatore wasn't just a businessman making a proposition. He was an enigma wrapped in Armani, and she was about to become part of his world in ways no contract could ever specify. When do you need an answer? Now. The word hung between them like a challenge. Chloe looked again at the document, then at the view of Manhattan through the windows, and finally at the man who was offering to change her life completely. She thought of her mother, worried and trying to hide her fear. She thought of her employees, people who had become family over the years. She thought of the company her father had built with his bare hands, the one she had sworn to protect. And then, surprisingly, she thought of the way Dante had looked at her when he said she was genuinely beautiful, as if he saw something in her that she didn't even recognize in herself. Where do I sign? The smile that lit up his face was different from the others. Warm, almost relieved. Here, he said, sliding a Mont Blanc pen across the desk. And here. As Chloe signed her name on the dotted line, She felt as though she were signing away much more than a contract. She was signing on to a new version of herself, stepping into a world where nothing would ever be the same. "Welcome to the Salvatore family, Chloe," Dante said. And for the first time since she'd entered his office, his smile truly reached his eyes. She didn't know it yet, but in that moment, they had both sealed something far more dangerous and beautiful than any contract could ever contain. They had planted the seeds of their own undoing and their salvation. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 6 months later, the Salvatore mansion was a silent testament to power accumulated over generations. Built in the 1920s on the Upper East Side, the five-story estate combined Gilded Age grandeur with contemporary touches that Chloe had carefully introduced over the months. On a Saturday morning, she walked barefoot across the heated marble of the gourmet kitchen, a steaming cup of Italian coffee cradled in her hands. She wore only a champagne silk nightgown and a robe that Dante had quietly left in her closet. Hermes, of course, in the exact shade that complemented her skin tone. It was strange how small gestures like that had become their routine. The robe that appeared mysteriously, the white lilies that were refreshed on her desk every Monday, her favorite flower, though she'd never told him, the special Colombian coffee he had sourced because he'd noticed her wrinkling her nose at the Italian blend he preferred. "Good morning, Mrs. Salvatore." Dante's deep voice made her turn. He was leaning against the doorframe, already dressed for his morning run in black lycra shorts and a t-shirt that perfectly molded to the physique she had learned to admire discreetly. His hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a vulnerability about him in that informal moment that made Chloe's heart quicken. "Good morning," she replied, trying to ignore the way his gaze swept over her. Even after 6 months, that look still made her feel as if he could read her every secret thought. "Coffee, please?" She moved through the kitchen with a practiced familiarity, preparing his coffee just the way he liked it, strong, no sugar, in one of the Italian porcelain cups that had been a wedding gift from his grandmother. It was a domestic ballet they performed flawlessly, each aware of the other's movements in a way that went beyond mere courtesy. "Tonight's dinner," Dante said, accepting the cup from her hands. For an instant, their fingers brushed, and Chloe felt the familiar electricity that always sparked in those casual moments. "The Rothschilds will be there. She has a reputation for subtly testing new wives." Chloe smiled, an expression that had become more genuine over time. "Leave it to me. I've handled worse." And it was true. In the past months, she had navigated Manhattan's social world with a grace that had surprised even Dante. Dinners with Russian oligarchs, charity galas where a single dress cost more than most people's annual salary, weekends in the Hamptons where politics and business mingled with the casual elegance of the ultra-rich. Chloe had discovered a natural talent for reading people, for finding genuine points of connection, even in the most superficial conversations. More importantly, she had learned to use her authenticity as a social weapon. In a world of calculated poses, her sincerity was both disarming and enchanting. "You look beautiful today," Dante said suddenly. There was something in the way he spoke the words that made her stop. She peered at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "I'm in my nightgown." "Exactly." The moment stretched between them, heavy with everything they left unsaid. Chloe had learned to recognize these instances when the line between performance and reality grew dangerously thin. When the man who had married her for convenience looked at her as if he wanted her, as if he wanted so much more than their contract specified. Dante's phone vibrated, shattering the spell. He checked the message and sighed. An emergency at the office. The deal with the Japanese. Go, Chloe said softly. I'll handle the preparations for tonight. He hesitated at the door, as if he wanted to say something more, but he just nodded and left. Chloe remained alone in the kitchen. The aroma of coffee mingled with the masculine scent he always left in the air. Something expensive and distinctly Italian, a scent she had begun to associate with safety. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glittered like a jewel in the Manhattan night. Austrian crystals dripped from the ornate ceiling, casting a golden light over the city's 300 most influential guests. The Salvatore Foundation's annual charity gala was one of the most anticipated events on the social calendar, a night where art and philanthropy danced with power and money. Chloe discreetly adjusted the diamond necklace Dante had insisted on giving her for the occasion. The gown she wore, a midnight blue Valentino that flowed like liquid silk, had been chosen during a shopping trip that had become surprisingly intimate. Dante had accompanied her personally, sitting in the exclusive boutiques of Fifth Avenue with the patience of a man who genuinely cared about the outcome. You're radiant this evening, Margaret Rothschild murmured, approaching with the sharp smile of a woman accustomed to dissecting others at social events. At 60, she was the unofficial queen of New York society, and her approval could make or break reputations. Thank you, Mrs. Rothschild. And how is Charles? For an hour, Chloe navigated the treacherous waters of high society small talk. She spoke of art, her genuine passion for Gaudi's architecture impressing a Spanish collector. She discussed philanthropy with real knowledge, having begun to involve herself personally in the Foundation's projects. She showed sincere interest in the lives of others, remembering details from past conversations, but her eyes always returned to Dante. He commanded the room effortlessly, moving between groups with the confidence of a man born to lead. His Bryony tuxedo was impeccably tailored, enhancing his imposing height and broad shoulders. When he smiled, the public smile he had perfected was charming but controlled. Only Chloe knew how to recognize his true smiles. He loves you deeply, doesn't he? Margaret's voice pulled her back to the present. Chloe followed the older woman's gaze and saw Dante watching them from a distance. Even across the crowded room, she could feel the intensity of his focus, the way he discreetly monitored her interactions, ready to intervene if needed. Yes, Chloe heard herself reply, and realized with a jolt that she wasn't lying. He loves me. The discovery struck her like lightning from a clear sky. Somewhere between the intimate dinners at home, the shared mornings in the kitchen, the glances across crowded ballrooms, something real had blossomed. Dante Salvatore, the man who had married her out of necessity, had fallen in love with her. And God help her, she had fallen in love with him too. And you? Margaret asked, with the insight of a woman who had watched relationships form and crumble for decades. Before Chloe could answer, familiar arms slid gently around her waist from behind. Dante's scent enveloped her like an embrace, and she leaned instinctively against his solid chest. Forgive the interruption, Mrs. Rothschild, Dante said, his voice laced with polite charm, but I need to steal my wife for the opening waltz. The word wife left his lips with a soft possession that had nothing to do with contracts or appearances. Chloe felt her heart give a treacherous leap. On the dance floor, under the golden lights, and the gaze of 300 pairs of eyes, Dante drew her into his arms with a familiarity developed over months of events just like this. His hand, large and warm, settled on the curve of her waist, the other entwining her fingers with a gentleness that belied his obvious strength. "You were perfect tonight," he murmured, close to her ear as they moved in flawless harmony. "Margaret Rothschild is notoriously hard to win over. You've completely charmed her." "It's easy when you have a good partner," Chloe replied, letting herself get lost in the moment. On the dance floor, it was easy to pretend that none of this was an act. The music swelled around them, a classic Strauss waltz performed with perfect precision by the orchestra. Other couples joined them, but Chloe was aware only of Dante, of the way he guided her effortlessly, of how his eyes never left hers, of the heat of his body so close to her own. "Chloe," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more intently. "I—" For a moment, she thought he was about to say something important, something that would change everything between them. His dark eyes were serious, almost vulnerable, and his hand tightened imperceptibly on hers. But then the music ended. Applause erupted around them, and the moment was lost. Dante smiled, the public smile back in place, and escorted her back into the crowd. The rest of the night passed in a blur of conversation, Dom Perignon champagne, and smiles for the photographers. But Chloe carried the memory of that moment on the dance floor with her, when, for a few precious minutes, it hadn't been Chloe Laurent playing the part of Dante Salvatore's wife. It had been a woman, simply dancing with the man she was falling in love with. Back at the mansion, it was well past midnight. Chloe ascended the marble staircase, her heels echoing in the lavish silence of the house. The diamond necklace felt heavy against her skin, a physical reminder of the night and the world she now inhabited. She paused before the door to her bedroom. The master suite she had redecorated with personal touches, transforming it from a cold, masculine space into something that reflected them both. Dante had insisted she take the largest room, moving himself into what was once a private study on the third floor. But she knew he sometimes stayed up late, working in the second floor library, which was near her room. She knew because sometimes she heard the soft rustle of pages turning. She saw the sliver of light from under the door when she passed in the hall. Tonight, the light was on. Chloe hesitated, still in her gala attire, her feet aching in the expensive heels. She could just go to her room, slip out of the dress, take a long bath, and pretend the moments on the dance floor had been just part of the performance. Or she could be brave. She knocked softly on the library door. "Come in." Dante was leaning back in the leather armchair near the fireplace. He was still in his tuxedo, but his bow tie was undone, and the top buttons of his shirt were open. A glass of whiskey rested on the side table, and he was holding a book, not a business report, but a well-worn copy of Asterisk, The Count of Monte Cristo Asterisk. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "Apparently, neither can you." Chloe entered the room, closing the door behind her. The atmosphere was intimate, warmed by the crackling fire and the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. This was where Dante came when he wanted to escape the weight of being a Salvatore. "It was a beautiful evening," she said, sinking into the armchair opposite his. "It was." He studied her with that intense gaze she had come to recognize. "You were luminous." Dante, she began, then stopped, unsure how to put words to what she was feeling. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. The words hung between them, both a confession and a promise. For 6 months, they had danced around the thing that was growing between them, respecting the lines of their contract, even as their hearts began to ignore its terms completely. What do we do now? She asked. Dante set his book aside and leaned forward. I don't know. The contract? Forget the contract, Chloe said, surprising herself with her own boldness. For one night, forget the contract. Forget the business. Forget the obligations. What do you want, Dante? Not the CEO, not the heir, the man. He watched her for a long moment, and Chloe saw the battle being waged in his dark eyes. Control versus desire, reason versus emotion, the calculating businessman versus the man who had learned to love her. Finally, he stood and walked to her, extending his hand. Dance with me, he said simply. There was no music, only the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the city below. But Chloe took his hand and let him pull her into his arms. They swayed slowly in the small space between the armchairs, closer than they had been on the plaza's dance floor. This time, there was no audience, no cameras, no role to play. It was just them, a man and a woman who had started as strangers in a business arrangement and were now dangerously close to becoming something far more real and infinitely more complicated. Chloe, Dante murmured against her hair, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer. She lifted her face to his, and for an eternal moment, they hovered on the threshold of something that would change everything. His lips were inches from hers, his breath mingling with her own, and the world had shrunk to the infinitesimal space between their racing hearts. The ring of his phone made them break apart, reality intruding on the moment like a splash of ice water. Dante answered it with a thinly veiled irritation. Salvatore. As he spoke in rapid Italian to whoever was on the other end, Chloe stepped back, the spell broken. What had almost happened between them was dangerous, not just to their contract, but to their hearts. Emergency in Milan, Dante said when he hung up. I have to fly out tomorrow. Of course, she replied, forcing a smile. Business first. He studied her intently, as if he wanted to say more, but he simply nodded. Good night, Chloe. Good night, Dante. She left the library with her heart pounding and the certainty that they had crossed an invisible line. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally. They had ventured into forbidden territory. And the most terrifying part was, Chloe found she wanted to go even further. The contract that bound them was becoming the weakest force between them. What was growing in their hearts was far more powerful, far more dangerous, and infinitely more real than any legal document could ever contain. 3 weeks later, Salvatore Tower stood against the gray Manhattan sky like a spear of glass and steel, piercing the low clouds that promised rain. On the 74th floor, the main conference room had been transformed into a theater for one of the most anticipated corporate announcements of the year. Chloe nervously adjusted her pearl necklace, a gift from Dante upon his return from Milan, as she watched the frantic preparations. Television cameras were being positioned, technicians tested sound equipment, and journalists from renowned financial publications spoke in hushed clusters, speculating on what Dante Salvatore was about to announce. The merger with Japan's Tanaka Industries had been kept a closely guarded secret for months. It would be the largest international acquisition in the history of Salvatore Holdings, expanding the empire into the Asian market in a way that would completely change the company's landscape. Nervous? Dante's familiar voice made her turn. He looked flawless in a navy Armani suit, his Hermes tie perfectly knotted, every detail of his appearance calculated to project power and confidence. But Chloe had learned to read the nuances. She saw the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against his thigh when he thought no one was watching. A little, she admitted. This is a huge deal. The biggest of my career. He agreed, moving closer. For a moment, in the midst of the controlled chaos, it was as if they were alone. Thank you for being here. There was a formality in his voice that made her heart ache. Since his return from Milan, Dante had been different, more distant, more absorbed in his work, as if he were trying to create space between them after that moment in the library. He had canceled 2 dinners at home, worked late every night, and when they did cross paths in the morning, his conversation had become too polite, too careful. Chloe missed him in a way that frightened her. She missed the genuine smiles, the conversations about architecture that stretched for hours, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Always, she replied softly, and saw something flicker in his eyes before he composed himself. Mr. Salvatore, an assistant approached discreetly. We're ready to begin. Dante nodded. He turned to Chloe one last time. Wish me luck? You don't need luck, she said, with a smile she hoped was encouraging. You're brilliant. For a fleeting instant, the smile he gave her was the real Dante. Not the CEO, not the heir to an empire, but the man who read Dumas in the library and remembered how she liked her coffee. Then he turned and walked to the podium, transforming into the imposing figure who would command the room for the next 40 minutes. Chloe took her seat in the front row, as she always did. Over the months, she had become a natural part of these events. The supportive wife, the elegant partner, the silent testament to the stability and power of the Salvatore name. She played the part of the supportive wife to perfection. Present, but never intrusive. Beautiful, but never garish. She wore the navy Valentino dress he'd once complimented, a small anchor of confidence in a sea of corporate sharks. The presentation began with the military precision that characterized everything Dante did. Impressive numbers scrolled across the giant screen behind him. Growth projections, market analyses, expansion strategies that showcased not just ambition, but genuine business genius. Chloe watched him with a familiar cocktail of pride and admiration. Dante, in his element, was a force of nature. He commanded the room effortlessly, anticipated questions before they were asked, and turned dry data into a compelling narrative of inevitable success. Salvatore Holdings isn't merely growing, he declared, his voice resonating with absolute authority. We are redefining what it means to be a global corporation in the 21st century. The applause was warm, respectful. The questions that followed were easy. Timelines, the impact on the American market, shareholder reactions. Dante answered them with the confidence of a man who had prepared for every eventuality. Then, a hand shot up. Sarah Mitchell, from Business Weekly *. Chloe knew of Sarah, an aggressive journalist who had built her reputation on unearthing scandals. There was always something predatory in her eyes, a hunger for stories that could shatter reputations. Mr. Salvatore, Sarah began, her voice cutting through the air like a shard of glass. This international expansion represents an enormous personal investment. Our readers are curious how your stable home life contributes to your confidence in making such high stakes plays. Specifically, how would you describe your marriage? A cold knot formed in Chloe's stomach. This wasn't a business question, it was a fishing expedition, a baited hook cast into their private waters. Dante stood motionless at the podium for a moment that stretched into an eternity. Chloe saw something flicker across his face, a flash that might have been panic or perhaps irritation at the invasion. My marriage, he began slowly, and Chloe felt every eye in the room dart to her before returning to the podium, is exactly what it needs to be for my position. The answer was evasive, professional. Chloe allowed herself to relax, just slightly, thinking he had skillfully navigated the treacherous question. But Sarah wasn't finished. Forgive my insistence, Mr. Salvatore, she pressed, a sharp smile playing on her lips. But there are persistent rumors about the practical nature of your relationship. Some suggest your marriage was more of a strategic merger than a romance. How do you respond to that speculation? And that's when Chloe saw it happen. She saw the precise moment Dante made the decision that would incinerate everything between them. She knew that look. It was the same look he wore when closing a brutal deal, when making a corporate decision that could cost millions. It was the look of a man calculating risk and reward in a split second, a man who prioritized the bottom line above any emotional consideration. And in that instant, with devastating clarity, she understood. Dante was about to choose his corporate image over her heart. Rumors are inevitable when one lives in the spotlight, he said, his voice taking on a colder quality. But since you insist on clarification, asterisk. No, asterisk, Chloe thought desperately, as if she could stop him with sheer force of will. Asterisk Dante, don't do this. But he had already made his choice. She is my wife by contract. The rest of the sentence was left to hang in the air, an execution left unfinished, but the damage was done. The words echoed through the conference room with the devastating force of an emotional bomb, and Chloe felt her world crumble, brick by dismantled brick. The silence that followed was deafening. 60 journalists sat suspended in a moment of collective shock, processing what they had just heard. The CEO of one of the country's most powerful corporations had just publicly admitted his marriage was a sham. Chloe couldn't breathe. The walls of the conference room seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick, suffocating. Her hands trembled uncontrollably in her lap, and she had to fight the urge to collapse right there, in front of the ravenous cameras. For one eternal moment, her eyes met Dante's across the growing chaos of the room, and what she saw in them was worse than anger, worse than regret. It was relief, as if he had finally verbalized a truth he had always known, one she had stubbornly refused to believe. Asterisk, contract, asterisk. The word reverberated in her mind like a death sentence. Not wife, not partner, not the woman he had fallen for, as she had naively begun to believe. Just a contract. The rising murmur of the journalists, excited questions, Cameras being repositioned to capture her reaction became a distant, unbearable noise. Sarah Mitchell was practically glowing, knowing she had just landed the story of the year. Chloe rose with the practiced dignity she had learned to cultivate over the past 18 months as Dante Salvatore's wife. Each movement was a masterpiece of control over the internal chaos consuming her. She would not break down in front of these people. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her heart shatter in real time. But inside, she was dying. She walked toward the exit with measured steps, her Louboutin heels clicking against the marble with military precision. She did not run, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. She did not look back, though she could feel Dante's gaze burning into her spine. She did not allow a single tear to escape for the drama-hungry cameras. Mrs. Salvatore? Mrs. Salvatore? The journalists' voices trailed after her, but she didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge their existence. The conference room door clicked shut behind her, the sound as final as a coffin being sealed. In the elegant corridor of Salvatore Tower, away from the cameras but not from the curious eyes of employees, Chloe finally let the mask slip, just slightly. Her hands found the cold marble wall for support as she fought to regulate the ragged, painful rhythm of her breathing. Humiliation burned in her throat like acid, mingling with a grief so profound it felt utterly unsurvivable. 18 months. 18 months of her life, lived inside a lie so elaborate she had actually started to believe it was real. All the shared mornings in the kitchen, all the dances at society galas, all the moments of burgeoning intimacy. It had all been a performance for him. Worst of all, she had started to fall in love. Not with Dante Salvatore, the CEO, not with the billionaire heir, but with the man who read classic novels in the library, who remembered her favorite flowers, who smiled a different way when they were alone. Who was that man, she wondered bitterly, if he could so casually destroy her in a room full of strangers? The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Chloe stepped inside like a sleepwalker. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely press the button for the ground floor. In the reflection of the polished steel doors, she saw her own face, pale and stricken. She saw the navy dress she had chosen with such care, the pearl necklace he had given her. A guilt gift, she realized now. He knew what he was going to do today. He knew he would humiliate her, and he had given her the pearls as a kind of preemptive compensation. In the lobby of Salvatore Tower, employees greeted her with the respectful, reserved smiles reserved for the boss's wife. Good afternoon, Mrs. Salvatore. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. She nodded mechanically, not trusting her voice. Outside, a cold rain had begun to fall, washing over Manhattan as if the city itself were weeping for her. Chloe didn't wait for the driver. She wanted no explanations, no pity, no witnesses to her unraveling. She simply began to walk down the wet streets, letting the rain mingle with the tears she finally allowed to fall. The $2,000 dress clung to her skin. Her carefully styled hair fell in damp strands. The professionally applied makeup began to streak in dark lines down her cheeks. But Chloe kept walking, each step taking her further from Salvatore Tower, further from the man who had just ripped out her heart and displayed it to the world as proof of his own calculated coldness. For 40 minutes, she wandered the streets of Manhattan like a lost soul, until, instinctively, she found her way to the one place that still made sense. The small architecture studio in Brooklyn that had been her life before Dante Salvatore, before gilded contracts and luxurious mansions, before she discovered it was possible to die of a broken heart while still being technically alive. The studio was locked. It was Saturday, and her small team didn't work on weekends. But Chloe had her keys, and the familiarity of the space comforted her like a hug from an old friend. She sat at her old drafting table, still damp from the rain, and finally allowed the dam of her composure to break. The pain she had been suppressing erupted in sobs that echoed through the empty space. Dante Salvatore had gotten what he wanted. His inheritance was secure. His image as a serious, focused businessman was preserved, and he had rid himself of any suspicion that inconvenient feelings might compromise his business decisions. And all it had cost him was the heart of the woman who, against all odds and all logic, had fallen in love with him. Back in Salvatore Tower, as journalists still bombarded the venue with questions about the bombshell revelation, Dante stood at the podium, trying to regain control. But his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He had won his billion-dollar merger and lost his soul in the process. And for the first time in his life, Dante Salvatore wasn't sure he'd made a good deal. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A week later, the Salvatore mansion had become a mausoleum of memories. Dante walked the empty halls like a ghost haunting his own life, each room echoing with Chloe's absence. The faint scent of her perfume still lingered, notes of gardenia and vanilla she'd chosen because it reminded her of spring, even in the harshest winter. Now, the phantom fragrance was a form of torture. In the gourmet kitchen where they had shared quiet mornings, the Italian coffee machine sat silent. Dante had tried to make coffee the way she did, the same precise ratio, in the same porcelain cup, but it always tasted bitter, incomplete, like everything else in his life since she'd left. His third-floor office was piled with work, but Dante couldn't focus for more than a few minutes at a time. Contracts awaiting his signature lay untouched. Urgent emails went unanswered. His legendary efficiency had disintegrated along with his marriage. Marcos Chen, his executive vice president and only close confidant, had tried to approach him 3 times that week about the Japanese merger. The investors were skittish after the press conference revelation. Salvatore Holdings stock had dropped 8% in 5 days. The market doesn't like personal instability, Dante, Marcos had said with his usual bluntness. You need to get control of this narrative. But how could he control a narrative when he couldn't even control his own thoughts? When every business decision led him back to the moment he had chosen to protect his image at the expense of the heart of the woman he loved. Asterisk, loved, asterisk. The word echoed in his mind with the force of a late, devastating revelation. He loved Chloe Lohan. Not the contract wife, not the perfect social accessory, but the woman who had turned his cold house into a home, who discussed Gothic architecture with genuine passion, who laughed at his bad jokes, and who looked at him as if she saw something in his soul he hadn't known was there. and he had publicly destroyed her to preserve his business reputation. The phone rang, jolting him from his self-destructive thoughts. It was Margaret Rothschild. "Dante, dear." The aristocratic voice cut through the line with surgical precision. "We need to talk." 30 minutes later, he was sitting in Margaret's opulent Upper East Side apartment, accepting a cup of Earl Grey he didn't want, while the matriarch of New York society studied him with eyes that had dissected generations of powerful men. "You're an idiot," she said, without preamble. Dante nearly choked on his tea. "I beg your pardon?" "Chloe Salvatore is the most genuine woman to move through our social circles in decades. Intelligent, elegant, authentic. And you humiliated her publicly. For what? To maintain your image as a cold, calculating businessman?" Margaret shook her head in disgust. "You men! You sacrifice diamonds for bits of glass." Dante set his cup down, feeling like a schoolboy being reprimanded. "It was complicated. Love is always complicated, dear. The question is whether you're man enough to fight for it." Margaret leaned forward, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "Where is she?" "I don't know." The admission came out as a defeated whisper. "She took one suitcase. She won't answer my calls or texts. It's like she's vanished." "Of course she vanished," Margaret snapped. "You shattered her heart in front of 60 journalists. What did you expect? That she'd stay for tea and discuss the weather?" The truth, in Margaret's unsparing words, hit him like a physical blow. For a week, he had allowed himself to believe that Chloe just needed time to cool off, that eventually she would come back and they could talk. But she wasn't coming back. Why would she? He had proven, in the most public way imaginable, that to him, she had never been more than a convenient business arrangement. "I've ruined everything," he said, and for the first time since childhood, Dante Salvatore felt the sting of tears in his eyes. Margaret sighed, her expression softening slightly. "Perhaps, but intelligent men find ways to fix their mistakes. The question is, do you love her, Dante? Truly love her? More than my own life?" The answer was immediate, raw, and true. "Then stop feeling sorry for yourself and go get her." Meanwhile, in Tuscany, Villa Rosmarina rose like a golden dream against the rolling, sea-kissed hills. The 17th century estate had belonged to Chloe's grandmother, passed down through generations of strong women who had found refuge amidst its vineyards and lavender fields when life became unbearable. Chloe had arrived 5 days earlier, an emotional refugee fleeing New York. The house had been closed since her Nana's death 3 years prior, but local caretakers had kept it in perfect condition, as if they knew that one day she would need this sanctuary. Now, sitting on the stone terrace that offered a panoramic view of the vineyards, Chloe felt like a woman rising from the ashes of her own naivety. The first 48 hours had been pure agony. She had cried until she had no tears left, screamed her pain at the empty hills, and questioned every moment of the last 18 months, searching for the signs she had missed, the clues that it had all been an elaborate performance. But on the morning of the third day, something had shifted. While watering the pots of geraniums that adorned the terrace, Chloe had felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of recognition. For 18 months, she had lived someone else's life, wearing clothes chosen by stylists, attending events that held no genuine interest for her, molding herself to fit Dante's vision of a perfect wife. But here, in Tuscany, with soil under her fingernails and the Mediterranean sun warming her skin, She was rediscovering who she truly was before she became Mrs. Dante Salvatore. Signorina, the voice belonged to Elena, the 70-year-old caretaker who had worked for her grandmother's family for decades. The architect from Florence has arrived. Chloe smiled, the first genuine smile in a week. She had called Lorenzo Benedetti, one of Italy's most respected restoration architects, to discuss renovating the villa. Not to sell it, but to transform it into the architectural studio she had always dreamed of. Lorenzo was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes that lit up as he saw the drawings Chloe had spread across the rustic kitchen table. Magnificent, he murmured, studying her sketches to convert the 17th century wine cellar into a modern workspace. You have vision, Signorina. You respect the history of the place while bringing it into the present. For 2 hours, they discussed local materials, restoration techniques, and ways to preserve the architectural integrity while introducing contemporary amenities. It was the kind of conversation Chloe had missed during her months as a socialite wife. Passionate, technical discussions about her true love, architecture. How long has it been since you've done this kind of work? Lorenzo asked as they walked through the old rooms. 18 months, Chloe replied, and she realized it sounded like a prison sentence served. Ah, he said, with the wisdom of one who had seen many lives change course. Sometimes we must get lost to find ourselves again. That night, alone on the terrace, under a starry sky that could never be seen through Manhattan's light pollution, Chloe wrote in a notebook she had bought in the nearby village. List of things I forgot about myself. I love strong coffee made in an old Italian pot. I prefer sunsets to sunrises. I dream of creating something permanent and beautiful. I don't need someone to complete me. I am already whole. I deserve to be loved for who I am, not for what I can represent. The last line made her pause. For 18 months, she had become the perfect wife for Dante, elegant, discreet, socially adept. But he had never fallen in love with Chloe Lohant, the passionate architect who preferred jeans to designer dresses, who could spend hours discussing the curve of a Brunelleschi dome, who dreamed of creating buildings that would last for centuries. He had fallen in love with an edited version of herself, and when the time came to choose between that version and his public image, the choice had been obvious. But perhaps that was a blessing in disguise. Perhaps Dante Salvatore had, inadvertently, given her the greatest gift of all, the chance to rediscover who she truly was when no one was watching, when there was no role to play, when she could simply be. Back in Manhattan, Dante sat in the mansion's library, the same room where he had danced with Chloe just a few weeks before. The book by Dumas lay open to the same page since she had left. He couldn't concentrate on anything that wasn't her. The desk was covered with reports from private investigators. 3 different security agencies, the most discreet in New York, had been hired to find her. The information was frustratingly scarce. A flight to Rome, then nothing. As if she had vanished into the European air. The phone rang. It was one of the investigators. Mr. Salvatore, we have a lead, a movement on her bank account. A cash withdrawal in a town called Montalcino in Tuscany. Small, a wine region. We're sending someone to investigate. After he hung up, Dante remained motionless for several long minutes. Tuscany. Of course. Chloe had mentioned once, during one of their intimate dinners at home, that her Italian grandmother had left her a country estate. She had spoken fondly of childhood summers spent there, of the vineyards and lavender fields. Why hadn't he thought of it before? Because for 18 months of marriage he had heard, but not truly listened. He had noticed, but not understood. He had seen the woman she became for him, but not the woman she truly was. Dante picked up the phone and dialed his private pilot. "Prep the jet," he said. "We're flying to Italy." "When, sir?" "Now." For the first time in a week, Dante Salvatore had a purpose beyond self-recrimination. He didn't know what he would say when he found her. He didn't know if she would forgive him, if she would give him a chance to explain, if there was anything left to salvage between them. But he knew he couldn't live the rest of his life without trying. The Salvatore Empire could wait. The Japanese investors could wait. His entire, carefully constructed existence could wait. Because for the first time in his life, Dante Salvatore had found something more important than power and money. He had found true love, and he had been foolish enough to throw it away. Now, all that was left was to find out if it wasn't too late to get it back. 3 days later, at Villa Rosmarina, the afternoon sun painted the Tuscan hills in shades of liquid gold as Chloe heard the distant sound of an engine approaching on the gravel road. She was in the villa's garden, her hands stained with soil after planting basil seedlings, when the deep, expensive rumble of a luxury car echoed through the valley. Visitors were rare. The villa was at the end of a private road, hidden among vineyards and ancient olive groves. She wiped her hands on the linen apron she had found in her nonna's kitchen and walked to the front porch. What she saw made her freeze. A black Maserati, the kind Dante drove when he wanted to be alone, was slowly climbing the winding hill. Even from a distance, she recognized the car's elegant silhouette, the precise way it was being driven. Chloe felt her heart hammer, with a mixture of panic and hope. Dante. Here. How had he found her? For a moment, she considered running inside, avoiding the confrontation she knew was inevitable. But something in her newfound sense of self stopped her. She was no longer the woman who ran from difficult situations. The Maserati stopped before the villa with a final sigh of its engine. The door opened, and Dante Salvatore emerged, a jarring vision of Manhattan transplanted to the Italian countryside. But this was not the impeccable Dante she knew. His dark hair was disheveled. His white linen shirt was creased, the sleeves casually rolled up. He was wearing jeans, something Chloe had never seen him wear, and his eyes held an exhaustion and a vulnerability she had never witnessed before. For an eternal moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance. Etal, standing by the car. She, on the villa's porch. Chloe. His voice carried on the afternoon air like a whispered prayer. She descended the stone steps slowly, each step a conscious decision to face the man who had shattered her heart. When they stood face to face in the lavender-scented garden, she could see the lines of tension around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw that hinted at sleepless nights. "How did you find me?" she asked, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Private investigators. A bank transaction in Montalcino." He paused. "It wasn't hard to connect the dots once I remembered the stories about your nonna. I remembered." The words carried a tacit admission. that he had heard but not truly understood at the time. You shouldn't be here, Chloe said, crossing her arms. We have nothing left to discuss. We have everything to discuss. Dante took a step toward her, then stopped when he saw her flinch. Please, Chloe, give me 5 minutes. Explain what? The anger she had suppressed began to surface. That your marriage of convenience became inconvenient? That your corporate image was more important than my feelings? That I was just a contract to you? No. The word exploded from him. You were never just a contract. Never. Funny, Chloe laughed bitterly, because that's exactly what you told millions of viewers. She's my wife by contract, not my. She couldn't finish. The pain still too raw. Dante ran his hands through his hair. I was afraid. Afraid? Chloe laughed without humor. Dante Salvatore, afraid of a question about his marriage? Afraid of admitting I had fallen in love with you, he said quietly, and the words hung in the air. A confession that changed everything. Chloe felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What did you say? I fell in love with you, Chloe. Completely, irrevocably, in a way that terrified me because I had never felt anything like it before. He moved closer, his dark eyes locked on hers. And when that reporter asked the question, when I felt all those eyes on me, waiting for me to admit a vulnerability, I panicked. So you destroyed me, publicly, to protect your ego, Chloe said, her voice now laced with a deeper ache. Yes, he admitted, without justification. I was a coward, a complete fool. And the moment the words left my mouth, I knew I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Chloe turned away, walking to the edge of the terrace. You humiliated me. You turned me into a footnote in your success story. I know. His voice was right behind her now. And I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you, if you'll let me. Chloe closed her eyes, fighting the urge to lean back against him. Why now, Dante? Why come all this way? Because I discovered I can't live without you, he answered simply. Because the mansion is just an empty house without your laughter. Because I realized I built an empire, but I lost my soul in the process. She turned to face him, seeing the raw truth on his face. And your business? The Japanese merger? Dante sighed. The Japanese canceled the deal. The stock dropped 15%. My grandparents are reevaluating my fitness to lead the family empire. A bitter smile curved his lips. Ironically, I achieved the exact opposite of what I was trying to protect. And that doesn't worry you? Chloe asked, genuinely curious. It should. For 34 years, this business was everything to me. But now, he reached out, his hand hovering near her face. Now, I know that power without love is just luxurious loneliness. For several minutes, they stood in silence. The only sounds were the distant chime of church bells from the village and the soft murmur of the wind rustling through the olive groves, filling the space between them. Chloe processed his words, battling against years of emotional defenses and 2 weeks of carefully nurtured pain. You hurt me, Dante, she said at last, deeply, in a way I don't know if I can forgive. I know, he replied, his voice low. And if you decide you can't, I will accept that. But first, let me show you something. He walked back to the Maserati and retrieved a leather folder from the back seat. Returning, he held it out to her. What is this? Chloe asked. Open it. With trembling fingers, she unfastened the folder. Inside were legal documents, pages and pages of dense text on official letterhead. On the very first page, in bold capital letters, were the words, Dissolution of Marital Contract. Chloe looked up at him, her expression a mask of confusion. I don't understand. Our original contract, Dante explained. I've had it nullified. Completely. He met her gaze, his own intense. If you come back to me, if you give me a second chance, it won't be because a legal document binds you. It will only be because you choose to. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the signatures, the official seals, the legal language that formally dissolved the ties that had first brought them together. But your inheritance, your grandparents, to hell with my grandparents, Dante said, with a vehemence that startled her. To hell with the inheritance. I'll build my own empire if I have to. But I can't build a life without you. Tears began to trace paths down Chloe's cheeks, the first she had shed since arriving in Tuscany. They weren't tears of pain this time, but of something more complex, more hopeful. Did you really come all this way just to serve me with divorce papers? She asked, a shaky laugh escaping her lips. I came to ask you to marry me again, Dante said. And then, to her utter shock, he knelt, right there in the villa's garden, on the very soil where she had planted her basil. Not by contract this time, for love, because I cannot imagine a single day of the rest of my life without you in it. Chloe stared down at him. This powerful man, kneeling in a Tuscan garden, his clothes rumpled and vulnerability etched across his features. He was offering not contracts or financial security, but only his shattered heart and the promise to rebuild it with her. Dante, she began, I know I don't deserve a second chance. He interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. I know I hurt you in a way that might be unforgivable. But if there is even the slightest possibility that you still feel something for me, if there is any chance we could start again, get up, she said softly. He obeyed, uncertainty and hope warring in his dark eyes. Chloe took his hands in hers, hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts, but which trembled now as they touched her own. These 2 weeks here have taught me something important about myself. Dante waited, barely breathing. I've learned that I don't need you to complete me, she continued. I am a whole woman, with my own dreams and ambitions. I can build a beautiful life for myself right here in Tuscany, following my passion for architecture. She saw the hope drain from his eyes, replaced by a painful acceptance. But, she went on, her voice softening, I've also learned that not asterisk. Needing asterisk, someone is very different from asterisk wanting asterisk them. And I want you, Dante, not the CEO, not the billionaire heir, but the man who reads Dumas in the library, who remembers my favorite flowers, who dances with me in the kitchen when he thinks no one is watching. Chloe. His voice was just a hopeful whisper. If we're going to try again, she said, her gaze steady, it will be as equals. No contracts, no obligations, no performances. Just two people choosing to be together because life is better when it's shared. Yes, he said immediately. Anything you want. And I want to continue my project here, she added, gaining confidence. To turn this villa into an architectural studio. To split our time between New York and Tuscany. Yes. And I want you to love me for who I really am, not the edited version I thought you wanted. I do love you, Dante said, stepping closer until she could feel his breath on her skin. I love your passion for architecture. I love how you argue with stubborn landowners. I love how you get dirt under your fingernails when you garden. I love how you turned my house into a home. And I love how you are turning this villa into your dream. And then finally, he kissed her. It was nothing like the polite kisses they had shared at public events, nor like the tension-fraught moments they had almost shared in the library. This was a kiss of new beginnings, of promises kept, of two people consciously choosing to love each other, despite, or perhaps because of, all the ways they had been broken. When they broke apart, they were both crying. So, Dante said, the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face since his arrival spreading across his lips. Will you marry me? Chloe laughed through her tears. Ask me again. Dante's brow furrowed in confusion for a moment, and then understanding dawned. He knelt once more in the garden, but this time he plucked a wild daisy that grew among the herbs and offered it to her as an impromptu ring. Chloe Laurent, he said solemnly, woman who has transformed my existence into a life, architect of houses and of hearts, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not for a contract, not for convenience, but for love, by choice, for all the days of the rest of our lives. Yes, she whispered, accepting the daisy and allowing him to slip it onto her finger like the most precious ring she had ever received. Yes, Dante Salvatore, I will marry you. This time, when he stood and took her in his arms, there were no cameras, no audience, no contracts. There was only the Tuscan sunset painting, the world in gold, the scent of lavender on the air, and two hearts choosing love over fear. Asterisk Villa Rosemarina, 5 years later. Rosa Marina Architectural Studio had become one of the most respected boutique firms in Europe, specializing in historical restorations that honored the past while embracing the future. Clients flew in from all over the world to consult with Chloe Laurent Salvatore, whose work Architectural Digest had once described as poetry built from stone and wood. On a sun-drenched September morning, she was in her office. The villa's old barn, now transformed into a light-filled space with exposed wooden beams and windows that perfectly framed the Tuscan hills. Reviewing blueprints for the restoration of a 16th century palazzo in Florence. Mamina! A high-pitched voice echoed across the courtyard, followed by the patter of small feet on ancient stone. Chloe smiled, saving her work, before turning to see 3-year-old Lucia Rose Salvatore running toward the office, dark curls flying, her white dress stained with gelato. Trailing behind at a more measured pace was Dante, carrying 18-month-old Marco Alessandro, who had inherited his mother's sapphire eyes and his father's Italian stubbornness. How was Sienna? Chloe asked, kissing her daughter, then her son, before leaning in for a longer kiss with her husband. Educational, Dante replied wryly. Lucia has decided she will either be an architect like her mother, or a Gelatia asterisk. Marco, on the other hand, tried to eat every fountain in the Piazza del Campo. Life had settled into a rhythm neither of them could have imagined back in the days of their original contract. They split their year between Manhattan, where Dante had rebuilt his company on his own terms, smaller but more ethical, and Tuscany, where Chloe had created not just a thriving business, but a haven where their growing family could connect with their Italian roots. The wedding they'd had 5 years prior, an intimate ceremony in the chapel of Montalcino, with only their families present, had proven that true love could indeed rise from the ashes of shattered pride. It hadn't been perfect. There had been arguments about splitting time between two countries, frustrations when major projects clashed with family milestones, and moments when the intensity of their Italian tempers left their children wondering if their parents still loved each other. But there were also mornings like this one, Dante playing in the garden with the children while she worked, knowing that in the afternoon they would trade places. He would close major deals via video conference while she took Lucia to pick out tomatoes at the local market. By the way, Dante said, setting Marco down on the floor where the boy immediately began to explore his mother's architectural models. Margaret Rothschild called. She wants to invite us to the Autumn Charity Gala in New York. Apparently, she's dying to see New York society's most royal couple again. Margaret had become not just an ally, but a surrogate grandmother to the children, spoiling them terribly whenever they visited New York and offering unsolicited marital advice that was usually, surprisingly, wise. We can go, Chloe said, but we fly back the next day. I have a meeting with the Milan clients on Thursday. Of course. Dante came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist as they watched their children play. You know, he murmured against her hair. Sometimes I still can't believe you forgave me. Sometimes neither can I, Chloe answered, leaning back against his chest. But then I remember that good people sometimes make bad choices when they're afraid, and that true love means choosing to forgive, to grow, and to build something better together. Asterisk ti amo, mia moglie, he whispered. I love you, my wife. He'd learned to say the words in Italian because he knew the language of her asterisk, nonna. Asterisk touched her in a special way. Asterisk, anch, io ti amo, she replied, turning in his arms. Forever. As they kissed, surrounded by the sound of their children's laughter and the scent of Tuscan lavender, it was impossible to remember a time when they had been strangers signing a cold contract. Now, they were simply Dante and Chloe. Not perfect, not without complications, but genuinely, deeply, and irrevocably in love. And this time, there were no contracts between them. There was only a choice, renewed with every sunrise, to build a life together that was worth more than any corporate empire or financial security. They had discovered that true love didn't need legal guarantees. It just needed two hearts, willing to choose each other every single day, forever.